Hello everyone and welcome to SplitSecond. This week we finally managed to group up with our fellow Brazilian counterpart, cEDH Brasil. If you don't know them yet, you should check their channel out as it's full of cEDH content from gameplay to podcasts and even some great interviews with some popular people in the EDH community. We gladly received Gabriel, Mastro and Mateus Nogueira, who brew some awesome cEDH decks that you can find in the database, like last week's Zaxara. For this week's match, Baal brought his own Winota, Mateus is on his Storming Teshar, Leite is piloting gillkohl's Kess Frozen Underworld, and Mastro is on his build for Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Mateus won the die roll and kept his first 7, and what a 7! Plains, Ancient Den and Arid Mesa for lands with a mana crypt as ramp. He especially hopes for a turn 1 infinite mana outlet so he can get LED with Enlightened Tutor and win turn 2, thanks to Savage Scout. Treasure Hunter is another good card, but requires a sack outlet to go infinite with a different line. Leite mulliganed once and found a Lucky Gemstone Caverns, alongside a Steam Vents. Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study will make sure his hand is always full, as well as Taxing Probe and Windfall. Dockside Extortionist will be great ramp up, especially considering Teshar is heavy on artifacts. Mastro also mulliganed once and got quite the ramped up hand as well, with a Snow-Covered Forest, Command Tower and Polluted Delta for lands. Mana Crypt and Landward Elves will easily produce 5 mana with his commander, with Dispel and Fierce Guardianship as protection, with hopes of grinding a slower match. Lastly, Baal also mulliganed once and also found a Lucky Gemstone Caverns, alongside a Blinkmoth Nexus and a Flooded Strand, Chrome Mox for ramp and Gorilla Shaman to trigger Winota, as well as have opponent's Moxon in check. Grenzo Havoc Razor is mostly card advantage, and Thalia Heretic Cathar can see play turn 1, delaying his opponents hopefully enough to maintain his presence as the last player in turn order. Ready for this match? As the game is starting, Leite and Baal announce their pregame actions, and in Upnap order, Leite puts a Gemstone Caverns into play, exiling a Taxing Probe, and then Baal puts his Gemstone, exiling a Blinkmoth Nexus. Mateus then starts his turn, and unfortunately he didn't find an outlet, but he still plays a Plains followed by a Salvage Scout, and casts a Mana Crypt right away to avoid being taxed by Mystic Remoras. He passes and Leite plays an untapped Steam Vents, and indeed casts his Mystic Remora before passing. Mastro starts his turn with a Command Tower and casts a Landward Elves. He then casts his own Mana Crypt, triggering the fish, and unable to pay, he passes. On Baal's turn, he plays a Flooded Strand and cracks it for a Plains. He then casts a Chrome Mox, triggering the fish and not paying. He imprints Grenzo, and after seeing 2 creeps on the field, he changes plans from Thalia to cast a Gorilla Shaman. It resolves, so he activates it targeting Mateus' Mana Crypt, destroying it, and then Mastro's Mana Crypt too, trying to even out the play field. He passes, and being set further behind, Mateus simply plays a Remote Farm and attacks Leite for 1 before passing. Leite lets Remora go after drawing him 3 cards, and plays an untapped Blood Crypt, just attacks the table again with a Rhystic Study. He passes, and on Mastro's turn, he plays a Snow-Covered Forest and casts his commander, Kinnan. Rhystic triggers and he pays for it, before passing. Baal fails to draw land, so he goes for the slow taxing plan, casting Thalia Heretic Cathar, triggering Rhystic and unable to pay. He attacks the black deck as well and passes. On his end step, Mateus sacrifices his Salvage Scout to return his Mana Crypt to his hand. Unfortunately, he draws the 3rd land in a row, so he plays a tapped Bazaar of Baghdad and casts his Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers and he pays for it. He then casts his commander, Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle, triggering Rhystic again, but unable to pay. It resolves, entering tapped, and he passes. Leite starts his turn with a tapped Marsh Flats. He then casts an Arcane Signet and follows it with a Demonic Tutor, getting a Hullbreacher to his hand, hoping to pair it with his Windfall. It's Mastro's turn. He plays a tapped Polluted Delta, and after probing his opponent's hand size, he casts his own Windfall. Rhystic triggers and he doesn't pay for it, as it most likely will be another card drawn with a Windfall. It resolves and everyone gets a new 7. He then casts a Sol Ring, not paying for the study, and passes. Baal drew 10 cards, but no lands to be found. Is this MTG Arena now? However, he got a Mana Crypt of his own. He does pay for Rhystic and is conflicted between casting Winota with a single possible trigger or trying to somehow police the table. He chooses the latter and casts a Path to Exile on Mateus' Teshar, which can be quite explosive. Rhystic triggers and he pays for it. He does not crack Mateus' crypt, so he's not out of the game completely, and the blue decks also need to worry about him. So instead he casts another Thalia, the Guardian of Thraben. Rhystic triggers and is unable to pay. He then attacks Leite for 4 and passes. Mateus gets to his turn and loses the crypt roll. He plays a tapped Command Beacon and then activates the Bazaar, drawing 2 and discarding 3. He then casts a Shriekhorn, which ends up costing 3 as he pays for the Rhystic. He passes, and on Leite's upkeep, he ponders on tutoring, but Shriekhorn came just in time to prevent that, despite being mostly used to target Mateus. He plays a tapped Misty Rainforest and cracks his flats for a basic swamp. He then casts a Dockside Extortionist, getting 5 treasures. He follows that with his commander, Kess, Dissident Mage, and then casts Demonic Tutor from his graveyard, getting a Thassa's Oracle, as he drew Tainted Pact. He goes to his cleanup and unsuspiciously discards a Brainstorm and a Brain Freeze. It's Mastro's turn and he plays a tapped Waterlogged Grove. He then casts his Simic Signet, paying for the Heuristic Study. He keeps up the trend of beating the Kess player and passes. Baal wins the crit roll and finally draws a land, a Plains. He ponders on Winota, but still has only one non-human to trigger, so he simply attacks Leite with all his creatures. On his second main phase, he casts Ranger Captain of Eos, paying for the Heuristic and getting a Serra Ascendant, that he ends up casting. It is another human that won't trigger Winota, but can hopefully maintain more pressure onto Leite's constant hunger to combo. He does pay for the Heuristic and passes. On his end step, Mateus activates the Shriekhorn, targeting himself and milling 2 cards. His crit roll comes unfavorably again, he draws and activates Shriekhorn again, milling 2 more cards, and then activates his Bazaar, further digging for outlets to win the game. After some thinking, he activates Command Beacon to bring Teshar to his hand, and then casts them by removing the last depletion counter from the remote farm. He doesn't pay for Heuristic and it resolves. He then casts Mox Opal, taxed by Thalia, and doesn't pay for Heuristic again. Teshar's trigger targets Foundry Inspector, so at least he can bypass Thalia's taxing. He then casts a Mishra's Bauble, triggering Teshar and targeting Salvager of Ruin and Heuristic Study. He pays the 1, and if it wasn't for Heuristic, Salvager and Bauble could allow him to draw as many cards as he would wish in latest upkeep. Tight on mana for all the taxing effects, he simply passes. On latest upkeep, Baal sacrifices his Ranger to silence Leite from potentially winning, with access to another DT, Intuition and Brain Freeze in his graveyard. In response, Leite cracks his Misty for a snow-covered island and casts a Vampiric Tutor. He goes for a Pact of Negation, hoping to win in the next unsilenced turn. He then simply draws and goes to end step, where Mastro cracks his Delta for a tapped Tropical Island. Leite then discards a Petal and an LED, further filling his yard for a Breach line. Mastro then gets to his turn and casts a Reshape, X equals 3 and sacrificing his Sol Ring, paying Thalia's tax but not Heuristic's trigger. That spells Basalt Monolith all over, so Leite responds with a Pact of Negation. However, Mastro casts a Swan Song, paying for Thalia's tax and the Heuristic trigger. Mateus hints that bouncing Thalia would allow him to interact, possibly with the swords on Kinnan. But priority passes and no one has an answer, so Reshape resolves, getting Basalt Monolith to the battlefield. This way, Mastro is able to generate infinite colorless mana by adding 4 with Basalt due to Kinnan and using 3 to untap it. However, what everyone else didn't know is that this was a desperation move, as he activates Kinnan and looks at the top 5 cards and finds no target. He plays a tapped Spire of Industry and refrains from attacking, fearing an incoming Winota, passing instead. The table sighs in relief, but for a short moment, as Mateus is only stopped from going infinite by Heuristic Study, Leite is spelling combo all over but seems tight on mana due to Thalia's taxing, and Mastro still has infinite generic mana to try to dig again next turn. Baal loses the crit roll and top decks nicely, a Deafening Silence. He casts it paying Thalia's tax, but not for Heuristic, so maybe Leite finds something to help with the Brazilian powerhouse. He goes to combat, sending Serra at Leite, the 2 Thalias at Mastro and the Gorilla at Mateus. He then passes, and on his end step, Mateus cracks his bubble to look at Leite's top card, a Notion Thief. On his upkeep, he draws 1 from the bubble and wins the crit roll. He draws and activates Shriekhorn one last time to better see his options. He then activates Bazaar, discarding some more options to the art. He follows that with Benevolent Bodyguard, triggering and paying for the Heuristic. With Teshar saved from bounces, he casts a Blasting Station, triggering Teshar to bring Phyrexian Walker to his hand, but not able to pay for Heuristic Study. Leite draws no answer, so Teshar's trigger and Blasting Station both resolve. Mateus then casts Phyrexian Walker for free due to Inspector Foundry evening out Thalia's tax. This combination of Salvager of Ruin with Blasting Station, Teshar and the Walker means he is able to ping everyone to death, sacrificing Phyrexian Walker with a Blasting Station targeting a player to deal 1 damage, then sacrificing Salvager of Ruin to return the sacrificed Walker to hand to be cast again, triggering Teshar, returning the Salvager to the battlefield, and tapping the station and repeating the process. However, Heuristic Study is taxing each Phyrexian Walker cast, allowing Leite to draw cards, so Mateus is pinging Leite on each iteration, hoping to kill him first to then be able to freely kill the rest of the table. However, on the 5th cast of Phyrexian Walker, Leite finds and casts a Force of Will, exiling an Arset. Note that while proposing this loop, the table actually forgot about the first Teshar trigger from the Phyrexian Walker, which would be able to bring an extra creature to the field. Being stopped there, Mateus plays a tapped Inventor Sphere, and sacrifices Benevolent Bodyguard, giving Foundry Inspector protection from red, to attack Leite freely and put him in check of any Thoracle cast, as earlier this round Leite revealed he had a Tainted Pact in hand but couldn't interact due to Deafening Silence. Leite goes to 2 life and Mateus passes. Note that any creature entering the battlefield will trigger Blasting Station to be untapped, which means that Mateus has Leite at gunpoint. This way, he plays a tapped Luxury Suite and casts a Mana Vault. He goes to Cleanup Step, also cleaning up some tears from his face, and discards a bunch of useless lands and a Deadly Tutor. Mastro gets to his turn and attempts to generate infinite mana, to which Mateus probes the table for any flashable creatures, so in response to the untap ability from the Basalt, Leite casts his Notion Thief. In response, Mateus activates his station, sacrificing Foundry Inspector to ping Kinnan for 1 damage, to which Mastro activates Basalt's untap ability again and proceeds with a loop to generate infinite mana. He then activates Kinnan once and finds a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, triggering as well as the Blasting Station, that untaps, and in response, Mateus activates it, sacrificing the Salvager to ping Kinnan for 1. Leite then responds by cracking his treasure for black, and Mastro then gets 10 treasures. Still in response, Mastro casts a huge Blue Sun Zenith for his whole library, which happens to be 2 more cards than Baal's, so after some thorough counting, Baal responds with a 4 mana Deflecting Swat, redirecting the Zenith to himself. Rhystic triggers and Leite draws a card. In response, Mastro activates Kinnan once and fizzles, activates it again, fizzling again, 3rd activation and he finds a Gilded Drake, entering and targeting Teshar, while Blasting Station also untaps and Mateus responds by sacrificing Teshar to ping Kinnan, hopefully the last time. Mastro still responds by activating Kinnan and actually fizzling again. He does it again, finding a Phyrexian Metamorph that comes into play as a copy of Dockside Extortionist for another 10 treasures. He then keeps activating Kinnan, fizzling 2 times and then finding a Thrasius. The table is still brainstorming on how Mastro would win after casting his non-creature spell for the turn, and so is Mastro trying to find a way out. He keeps activating Kinnan with the infinite mana and some treasures, finding a Prophet of Distortion and then Consecrated Sphinx, stopping there and letting the stack clear. Mastro chooses not to draw from the Sphinx's triggers and instead continuously activates Thrasius, still in response to Notion Thief, so all his lands come into play instead of to his hand. At this moment we were having some connectivity issues and the last section of the footage was degraded, but for the sake of this good game we will narrate what happened but use a freeze frame. Mastro gets all but 2 cards from his deck to his hand, only to sadly find what his mind was unable to dig, a Hull Breacher. He casts it as well as all his other creatures. Spellseeker and Trophy Mage let him to see what the 2 last cards of his deck are, and then he discards to hand size before passing, hopefully trying to win next turn with a huge Finale of Devastation. Baal loses the crit roll and draws. He plays a Plains and casts a Grand Abolisher, not paying for Rhystic because of Hull Breacher, to which Mastro needs to respond to. He generates infinite generic mana and casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift to get rid of Deafening Silence, to which Baal responds with a red Elemental Blast, and with it the table's fate is sealed. He then casts a Dockside Extortionist and Mastro sacrifices all his treasures in response. Baal gets 10 treasures and proceeds to cast Kiki Jiki. He follows that with a Village Bellringer, and with those 2 he activates Kiki Jiki, copying Bellringer that untaps all his creatures, and this way gets infinite Bellringers with haste and attacks for lethal. GG. Thank you for joining us for today's match, everyone. After each player's attempt at winning through a few stacks, a Winota-less win comes through a Deafening Silence and some lengthy stacks. We'd like to start the credits by thanking our current patrons, and especially Izanagi, Stefan, TJ Rapp, Mike Burr, Ajimo, and Crestable, Drunken Housecat, V, RJ, and Heated Chill, our stack breakers. If you want to support us, you can do so by liking this video, subscribing, or by becoming a patron yourself. If you want to go through other Commander adventures, click one of the videos on the right. If you want to talk with us about our games or other EDH related matters, join us on Discord. Join us again next week for a new set of Commanders and more decisive plays. See you all then.